They called her the woman who spoke to ghosts. Not aloud, of course. The pack had a way of saying such things with only the curl of a lip, the sideways flick of an eye, the barely contained laughter that broke open like rotten fruit whenever Nubia Wanderer walked past with her baskets and her salt, and her unflinching white hair catching the summer light like a second sun. They whispered it between mouthfuls of roasted rabbit and generous cups of fermented berry wine during the festival of the high moon, when the pack celebrated a full year without war, without shadow, without reason to fear the horizon. They murmured it while their children played in the warm dust, and their wolves napped in the shade, and the world smelled only of wildflowers and fat and careless joy. She was the widow who could not let go. She was the Omega who had forgotten how to be still. She was, in the quiet estimation of nearly everyone who shared her territory, a woman broken by grief and reassembled incorrectly. But on a morning in the fullest heat of summer, when the sun pressed down on the land like a hand over a wound, Nubia Wanderer rose before the birds and tied back her white hair and picked up her sharpest blade, and she began again. The first thing she did each morning was the same thing she had done every morning for 3 months. She walked to the cold storage at the back of her stone cottage, pulled open the heavy wooden door, and stood for a moment in the preserved darkness, reading the inventory she had written on birch bark and pinned to the wall with an iron nail. Rows of numbers, columns of weights, margins of calculated days. She ran her fingers along the tallies the way another woman might have run them along a child's hair, with a tenderness that was also a form of arithmetic, a love that was also a plan. Then she went to the slaughter yard. The deer that the 2 young pack hunters had begrudgingly delivered to her that week, payment in kind for the herb poultices she made for old Rena's infected leg, hung from iron hooks in the shade of her eastern wall. Nubia studied them with calm professional eyes, tilting her head, measuring the yield in her mind before the knife ever touched flesh. There was a science to it that most people in the pack had never needed to learn, because most people in the pack had never needed to plan for catastrophe. Why would they? The kingdom was at peace. The Alpha King was strong. The winter stores were full enough, more or less, and if they grew thin toward the end of the cold season, there was always the spring hunt to look forward to. Nubia had heard all of this before. She had also heard Cadmus speak in his sleep during the last months of his life, when the fever burned him down to something thin and transparent, and she had sat beside him in the long nights holding his hand, and she had learned to listen to what came out of a man when all the performance was stripped away. What came out of Cadmus, the old warrior, the silver-ranked fighter who had survived 11 border conflicts and returned from each one with new scars and old silences, was not peace. What came out of Cadmus in the dark was the same word, over and over, spoken with the certainty of someone who has seen the mechanism behind the curtain. Not yet. She had asked him once in one of his lucid afternoons what he meant. He had looked at her from his pillows with eyes that were already beginning to let go of the present world, and he had smiled the particular smile of a man who has accepted something that others have not yet been asked to carry. "The peace we have now," he had said, his voice rough as bark, "was bought with debts that haven't been called in yet. Every generation thinks the war before it was the last one. They're wrong every time." She had not argued with him. She had simply listened. And when Cadmus died 3 weeks later, and the pack filed in and out again with their faces arranged in appropriate shapes of condolence, Nubia had sat alone in the empty cottage for 1 full day and 1 full night, and then she had gotten up. She had gotten up because Cadmus had not been speaking from fever. He had been speaking from experience, and she trusted his experience more than she trusted the peace. Before we continue with the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment to check out our Patreon and become a member. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive content you won't find here on YouTube, extended stories, special scenes, early access to new episodes, and complete romance arcs created just for our supporters. As a bonus, you'll also unlock exclusive vampire romance stories, diving into darker, more intense love stories filled with desire, danger, and passion. By joining, you're directly supporting the channel and helping us bring even more immersive stories to life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. So through the late spring she had prepared. Quietly, methodically, without announcement or explanation, she had begun the slow work of accumulation. She traded herb services for additional deer. She bargained her sewing work for extra salt, great blocks of it from the eastern trade caravans that passed through twice a season. She spoke to Aldrich the tanner about the use of his secondary drying racks, and in exchange she mended his children's winter boots, and the arrangement was sealed with a handshake and the mutual understanding that neither of them would discuss it where others might hear and laugh. Because they would laugh. They did laugh. It started small. A few of the younger pack members pausing on the road past her cottage, wrinkling their noses at the rich iron smell of curing meat, exchanging glances that said everything their mouths hadn't needed to. Then one of the women at the communal well mentioned it aloud, and the laughter that followed was the kind that carries on the wind and finds every ear within a quarter mile. The widows added again, adding another row of racks. How many does that make now? 20? 30? She's building a wall out of dead deer. Someone should tell her the kingdom has an actual wall, made of actual stone, and it works perfectly well. Poor thing. She's never been right since Cadmus died. Nubia heard every word of it. She had wolf's hearing, the same as the rest of them, sharper than human hearing, tuned to frequencies most people never consciously registered. She heard the laughter the way you hear rain when you are already indoors. It fell on her, and she noted it, and it ran off. She continued her work. By midsummer, the racks stretched in organized rows across the wide field behind her cottage, 60 feet of them, then 80, then 100. The meat hung in long strips and compact bundles, perfectly salted, evenly spaced to allow the hot summer air to move between them. She had learned the ratios from an old text Cadmus kept, a military provisioner's handbook from 3 wars back, dense with numbers and notes in the margins in a handwriting she didn't recognize, corrections and amendments made by hands long since gone to dust. She followed the recipes with religious precision. Too much salt, and the meat became inedible. Too little, and it rotted. The balance was everything. The pack named the smell. They called it the stench of the Omega's madness. Children were warned not to run through her fields, though most of them did anyway on dares, weaving between the hanging rows and shrieking with exhilarated disgust before tumbling back out onto the safe road and laughing all the way home. Nubia watched them sometimes from her doorway. She did not shoo them. Children were not responsible for what they had been taught, and they had been taught that she was safely strange, safely harmless, a cautionary tale about what grief could do to a woman with too much time on her hands. She did not resent them their laughter. She pitied them their ignorance. Then one afternoon in the deep heat of late summer, when the sky was white with haze and the fields shimmered, and even the wolves lay panting in whatever shade they could find, she looked up from her work to find a shadow she did not expect standing at the edge of her property. He was taller than she remembered from the brief public occasions when she had seen him at a distance, and broader through the shoulders, the kind of build that was not merely the product of training, but of something genetic and unstoppable, bone and sinew assembled by ancestry into a shape that announced itself before the man inside it spoke a single word. His black hair was long, pulled back with a leather cord today, and the short dark beard along his jaw caught the light in a way that made it look like shadow given texture. He was wearing a plain riding coat rather than the ceremonial layers she associated with his public appearances, and he had no escort that she could see, which was unusual enough to be interesting. Alpha King Grillion Mistfang stood at the edge of Nubia Wanderer's property and looked at her rows of drying meat with an expression she could not quite name from this distance. She wiped her hands on the rough cloth at her belt and walked toward him. She did not hurry. This was her land. This was her work. The Alpha King's presence did not change either of those facts, and she had learned long ago, married to a warrior, living at the Omega end of a hierarchy that arranged people with cheerful ruthlessness, that the pace at which you walked toward power said as much as anything you might say when you arrived. She walked at her own pace. He watched her come. When she was close enough to see his eyes, dark gray, the color of deep water under cloud cover, she saw something she had not expected to find there. Not amusement. Not the particular condescension she had braced herself for. There was a quality to his attention that felt less like judgment and more like calculation. He was looking at her racks of meat the way a general looks at a map. "You've been busy," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, and quiet. The kind of voice that does not need to raise itself to be heard. "All summer," she agreed. He let his gaze travel the full length of her operation. The rows and rows, the organized categories, the labels she had painted onto small pieces of wood to mark dates and weights. When his eyes came back to her, there was something in them that might have been respect, or might have been the earliest stage of unease. "Everyone says you've lost your mind," he said. He said it without cruelty, simply as a statement of reportable fact. "I know," she said. "Is that a concern to you?" She looked at him for a moment. The sun was directly behind him, which meant she was squinting slightly and he was not, which was probably not accidental for a man who had grown up navigating the theater of power. She considered the question as honestly as she could, which was the only way she knew how to consider things. "It would be a concern," she said, "if their opinion were a more reliable guide to reality than my own observations. Since I don't believe it is, no." A silence stretched between them, filled with the soft sound of meat swaying in the hot breeze. "Cadmus was a good soldier," Grillian said finally. "He was an extraordinary soldier," she corrected. Not with sharpness, but with precision. There was a difference between good and extraordinary, and Cadmus had earned the distinction with decades of blood and discipline. The king tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the correction. He trained under Commander Velok in the Eastern campaigns. Velok believed in reading the long patterns, the ones that take generations to complete. He paused. Cadmus believed the same thing. She studied him with new interest. He had done his reading, or perhaps his listening. The kind of intelligence gathering that didn't look like intelligence gathering. "Did you come here to tell me what my husband believed?" she asked. Not unkindly, genuinely curious. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like it was deciding whether to become a smile. "I came to see for myself," he said. She waited. "I've been receiving reports," he said, "about the situation to the east. The Varek clans have been consolidating territory for 3 years. Quietly. The way a man prepares a fist before he throws it." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw tightened. "My advisors tell me the alliances are secure. The borders are strong." "And you?" she asked. He looked at her directly. Those gray eyes, steady and measuring, the eyes of a man who had been raised to carry large weights and had learned to distribute the burden with care. "I'm not sure," he said. It was, she understood, a significant admission. Men in his position were not generally trained toward uncertainty. Certainty was the product they were expected to provide, to their warriors, their pack, their territory. The admission cost him something, and she recognized the price of it, because she had paid similar prices herself. Every day that she had continued her work, while the pack laughed and the summer burned. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "I'll show you the calculations." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the strange sensation of being seen more completely than she was accustomed to, as if the number of eyes in the world that knew how to actually look was very small, and she had accidentally found one of them. "All right," he said. He came back the next morning and the morning after that. The first day she showed him the spreadsheets, her birch bark pages, covered in her careful handwriting, cross-referenced and annotated. He sat at her rough kitchen table and read them with the focused attention of a man reading military intelligence, which was, she had begun to understand, essentially what they were. She watched him work through the numbers, watched the moment when he stopped reading like a king making a courtesy call and started reading like a general who had found a report he should have had weeks ago. "Where did you learn to calculate like this?" he asked. "Cadmus's books. And practice." She set a cup of pine needle tea in front of him without asking whether he wanted any. He picked it up automatically and drank it, still reading. "A woman alone needs to understand her own resources, especially an Omega woman." He looked up at that. There was something careful in his expression. "You don't carry that word the way most Omegas do," he said. He was not being unkind. He was observing. "I carry it the way Cadmus taught me to carry everything he thought mattered," she said. "Not as a judgment, just as information. Omegas are not given institutional resources or collective protection the way ranked wolves are. Therefore, an Omega who wishes to survive must plan better than everyone else, and trust almost no one." She paused. He was not sentimental about hierarchy. He understood it as a system of incentives and believed in working within it without being defined by it. Grillian was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like he was a remarkable man," he said, and this time it was not the polished condolence of public life, but something that sounded genuinely meant. "He was," she said. And then, because it was true, and she had never been good at pretending things were not true, "I miss him every day. But that's not what this is about." He looked at her. "What is this about?" She met his gaze steadily. "This is about the fact that he spent 40 years watching the world, and in his last living breath, he told me what he saw. And I believe him." She picked up her own cup. He would have thought this was obvious preparation, not extraordinary preparation. But he also knew that most people don't prepare for what they haven't personally experienced yet. A small, dry pause. "So I prepared for both of us." Grillian looked back down at the birch bark pages, and she watched something shift in his face, something she had not seen on a man's face in a long time. She had seen respect before. She had seen attraction before, in the early years of her life before Cadmus, when she had been young enough to be naive about what attracted people and what was merely projection. She had seen calculation, and she had seen loneliness, and she had seen the particular wariness of powerful people who have been surprised by someone they had underestimated. What she saw in Grillian Mistfang's face was something rarer. It was recognition, as if he had been holding a piece of a picture he didn't understand, and had just found the piece that showed him what the whole image was meant to be. It made her feel, briefly and unexpectedly, less alone. He came back the day after that with maps. They spent 3 hours at her kitchen table, comparing his strategic assessments of the eastern border with her long-range provisioning calculations. And the picture that emerged from the intersection of those two sets of numbers was not comfortable. It showed a gap between the timeline his advisors believed they were operating in and the timeline the accumulating evidence suggested was actually in play. A gap wide enough to fall through. "Your numbers suggest the eastern trade routes have been degrading for 18 months, he said. He said it quietly, the way you say things that change the shape of the room. "The salt caravans have been arriving late since last spring," she confirmed. "Not by chance. By redesigned routing, someone has been gradually moving them." She tapped the relevant column on her calculations. "The merchants I spoke to were vague about why, which means they'd been given reasons not to be specific." He looked at the map with his thumb pressed to the eastern border, not quite touching the line of text that named the Varric territories. "My chief advisor believes the Varric's recent movement is internal politics," he said. "Clan disputes, nothing that crosses borders." "Your chief advisor has never provisioned an army from scratch," she said, not with contempt, but with the flat accuracy she applied to most things. "The movement patterns look like preparation to me. Specifically, like the consolidation phase that Cadmus described from the Eastern campaigns of 20 years ago. You amass the supply chain before you amass the force. The force comes last, because it's the last thing you need. The silence was different now. She had sat in many silences with powerful men over the years. As Cadmus's wife, in the background of war council discussions she was not supposed to be listening to, and she had learned to read their textures. This one was the silence of a man updating a model. The costly kind. The kind that requires you to accept that something you believed was solid is, in fact, uncertain, and to hold yourself steady while you do. If you're right, he said slowly, we have less time than I've been assuming. If I'm right, she agreed. He looked at her with an expression that had shed whatever remaining layers of Alpha King performance it had been carrying when he first walked to the edge of her property. What do you need? He said. And something opened in her chest, unexpectedly, like a window in a room that had been shut for too long. She had not been asked that question in a very long time. She did not let herself sit in the feeling, because there was work to do, and the work, as always, came first. But she noted it. She filed it away in the same careful way she filed her inventory tallies, in a column whose heading she did not yet dare to write. More salt, she said. And help moving the dried stores underground before the season turns. He nodded. Done, he said. The summer ended. The last of the great heat broke in a single night, and the morning after was the kind of morning that feels like a held breath finally released. Cooler, cleaner, the sky a deeper blue, the shadows longer and more definite. Nubia stood in her field and looked at what she had built, and felt something she had not quite allowed herself to feel through all the months of work. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter and more private. A sense of having kept faith with the person who had trusted her with the most important thing he knew. She was packing the last of the summer's dried stores into the cave system behind her property. A series of natural chambers she had spent 3 weeks adapting with wooden shelving and ventilation gaps, and carefully sealed side passages to manage humidity, when a sound reached her from the direction of the valley road. It was a sound she recognized without wanting to recognize it, because she had heard it before in stories, and in Cadmus's voice when he recounted things he had witnessed. And it was the sound of a large number of people moving together in a direction they had not chosen. Panic, organized by fear, flowing through the pack like water through a cracked dam. She straightened. A young boy she didn't know, one of the tanner's children, she thought by his coloring, came sprinting through her gate and stopped when he saw her, gasping, his face pale under his summer tan. Bandits? She said. Because she knew the sound was bigger than bandits, but you ask the small question first. Army, he managed. Eastern Army. Flags she'd never seen. They burned. They burned the river farms this morning. He doubled over, hands on his knees, fighting his breath back under control. They're blocking the trade roads, all of them. The Alpha King has called everyone inside the walls. She was already moving before he finished speaking, already calculating, already running the numbers in her head that she had run and rerun all summer. How much she had stored. How many people the pack numbered. How long winter would run. How much of the stored food she could get to the castle before the siege lines tightened. The answer, if they moved quickly, was most of it. She found Aldrich at his tannery, loading his family into a cart, his face gray with a particular shade of fear that older people get when a thing they thought was over turns out to have been merely resting. How much of my stock can your cart carry? She asked without preamble. He stared at her. Nubia. How much? He looked at the cart, looked at his family, did the calculation the way a practical man does calculations, with his hands and his eyes before his brain catches up. 300 or 400 pounds, he said, maybe 5. Take 500 pounds of the dried stores from my east field. I'll show you the loading order. She paused, looking at his face. Your family first, then the supplies. Understand? He nodded, and she saw that he was not laughing at her now. None of them were. She made 3 trips with her own cart, before the roads became too crowded to move efficiently. Each time she came back to her property, the cave system remained accessible. It was beyond the siege line she had checked. And each time she loaded the cart, she moved the highest caloric density items first. The salt, the hardened jerky that would last the longest, the compressed provisions she had made by boiling and drying meat together with rendered fat into solid blocks. An old military technique from Cadmus's provisioner's manual that the pack had found deeply unappetizing and hilarious when she described them. They would not find them unappetizing now. She was on her 4th trip, moving more slowly because the cart was older than the others, and the wheel axle was protesting, when she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to find Grillion Mistfang riding hard down the field road, alone, his black hair loose, and his riding coat gone in favor of partial armor, and his face doing something she had not yet seen it do. He looked frightened. Not for himself, she understood immediately. The fear on his face was the particular quality of fear that lives in the chest of a person responsible for others, when the thing they feared for those others starts to come true. It was an accountable fear, a weight-bearing fear. He pulled up beside her, and she saw in the same moment that he saw her, and the brief, pure relief on his face, before he controlled it back into the shape of command, was something she would remember for the rest of her life with a clarity that surprised her. "I was coming for you," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not done yet." He dismounted, tied his horse to the side of the cart, and without a word began loading alongside her. She looked at him for one moment. The Alpha King, broad and dark, and radiating the particular physical presence of a man who had been bred for exactly this kind of extremity. And she felt the strange telescoping sensation of time folding, of this moment, and every moment that had led to it suddenly being visible as a single connected line. Cadmus's voice in the dark, her knife in the summer dawn, the salt and the sweat and the laughter she had refused to internalize. This moment. "How did you know?" he said. He was loading efficiently, no wasted movement. She noted this about him, that he was not the kind of powerful person who needed the performance of exertion. He simply worked. "Cadmus told me," she said simply. "He told you about the Varex. He told me about patterns." She passed him a bundle of salt-wrapped jerky, and he tucked it into the cart without breaking stride. Specific patterns. The way small disruptions in trade routes accumulate in the months before a campaign. The way internal clan politics resolve more cleanly when they're being resolved in preparation for something external. She reached for another bundle. He saw the same signatures in the Eastern campaigns of his youth. He knew what they added up to. And he told you. He told me everything. A beat. He didn't have anyone else to tell. Grillion was quiet for a moment, working. She could feel him thinking beside her. Not the polished surface thinking of public performance, but the deep water thinking of a man genuinely rearranging his understanding of something. "I underestimated you," he said. It was not the rehearsed apology of politics. It was direct, flat, and honest in the particular way that honesty becomes when it's costing you something. "So did everyone else," she said. "I'm used to it." "That's not something you should have to be used to." She stopped for a moment and looked at him. He was looking back at her, and the evening light, the sun was going now, the sky going orange and red in the west, which should have been beautiful, and instead felt like warning, fell across his face and showed her something she had been noting in small increments over the weeks of their quiet collaboration. That Grillion Mistfang, the Alpha King who made the pack feel the ground was solid and the sky was reliable, was also a man who carried loneliness the way some people carry old injuries. So well compensated that most people never saw it. Visible only in unguarded moments. This was an unguarded moment. "It's information," she said finally, and returned to loading. "What you do with it is the only thing that matters." The cart was full. She climbed up to the driver's seat and looked down at him, at this large, careful, frightening, unexpectedly gentle man, standing in her field in the fading light, with one hand resting on the side of her cart. "Come on," she said. "There's more in the cave." He retrieved his horse and walked beside the cart back to the hidden entrance in the rock face, and she watched from the corner of her eye as he ducked through the low opening and stood inside the cave system and looked at what she had built. Even in the circumstances, even with the sound of the army's encampment fires beginning to glow in the eastern dark, there was a moment of pure stillness in him that she recognized as genuine shock. The shelves ran from the floor to the arched ceiling of the first chamber and extended back through 2 more chambers beyond it. The meat was arranged by type and date and caloric density, each section labeled in her clear handwriting, each bundle precisely weighed. The salt stores occupied a sealed side chamber. The fat blocks, which could be dissolved into soups to double their volume and caloric impact, were stacked with military precision along the north wall. It was, by her estimates, enough food to sustain the pack at reduced rations for 4 months. Longer if they were careful. Long enough, possibly, for the Allies in the West to hear and respond. Grillian stood in the middle of the first chamber and turned slowly, taking it all in. His face was doing something she could not entirely interpret, which was unusual for her. She had become, over years of necessary observation, a fairly precise reader of faces. What she saw was not merely surprise, though there was that. It was not merely gratitude, though that was also present. It was something more complex, more layered, as if several different recognitions were happening at once, and his face was trying to accommodate all of them. "Cadmus was right," he said finally, quietly. "About most things," she agreed. He turned and looked at her directly in the lantern light, and in his face, she saw the recognition she had noticed at her kitchen table weeks ago. The piece of a picture feeling, but larger now, more certain. "So were you," he said. They worked through the night. By the time the first true siege lines were established, and the Eastern Army had settled into the ugly patient business of starving out a walled territory, Nubia had moved the majority of her cave stores into the castle's secondary larder, cataloged them, and begun teaching the castle staff her rationing system. She worked in the methodical, unhurried way she did everything, as if catastrophe were simply another set of problems to solve, which was, she had come to understand, the only attitude that was actually useful in a catastrophe. The pack, who had laughed at her all summer, watched her now with faces rearranged by shame into something that kept trying to become gratitude and not quite succeeding. She did not encourage them in either direction. Shame was not useful. Gratitude, if it curdled into debt, was not much better. What was useful was that people understood the rationing system and followed it, and for that she needed their attention and their cooperation, not their feelings. She got both. Grillian put her in charge of the food logistics on the 3rd day of the siege, giving her the title Provisioner of the Realm, invented on the spot, possibly unprecedented, but it gave her the authority she needed to do the work, without arguing about who she was. She did not particularly care about the title. She cared about the work. The king's strategy room became the de facto center of all decisions. Nubia was there every day with her birch bark pages, speaking in the same clear, quiet voice she used for everything. Watching the numbers she recited changed the texture of every conversation. She watched Grillian listen to her with his full attention, without performing the listening, which was rarer than people realized. He absorbed what she said and asked questions that showed he had genuinely processed it. He pushed back when he thought she was wrong. She pushed back when she thought he was wrong. The first time she corrected his calculation of the northern supply route, and he went quiet before saying, with that careful honesty of his, "You're right." Something in the room shifted. The general's eyes moved between them with a new quality of attention. The nights were long and often sleepless. Nubia worked late in the small room near the larder and would often hear footsteps in the corridor outside, footsteps she had learned to recognize, pausing briefly at her door before continuing. The 3rd time, she opened the door before the pause could become a departure. He was standing there with 2 cups of something that steamed, and an expression that said he had not entirely decided what he was going to do with himself. In the torchlight of the corridor, he looked for a moment less like the Alpha King and more like a large, tired man who had been carrying a heavy thing for a long time. "I thought you might still be working," he said. "I thought you might still be awake," she replied. He looked at the cups. "Pine needle tea," he said. "I remembered you made it." She stepped back and let him in. They sat across from each other at the small table under her window, and outside the distant orange of the siege fires was visible against the dark hills, and inside the room was lamplit and warm and smelled of the dried herbs she hung from the rafters for the sleep they were not getting. The cups steamed between them. "Tell me something that isn't about the siege," he said. She looked at him for a moment, considering. It was, she recognized, a significant request from a man whose entire public identity was organized around the siege, around the crisis, around the steady performance of competence under pressure. He was asking her to be somewhere else for a moment with him. He was asking for a door out. "Cadmus and I met over a disagreement about salt," she said. Something in his face eased. "Tell me." She told him how she had been working in the market at the Eastern Gate, helping old Lena, the herb merchant, and Cadmus had come to buy provisions and been overcharged. She had said so aloud without meaning to, having the unfortunate habit of speaking precise thoughts, and Cadmus had turned and looked at her, with none of the condescension she expected from a ranked soldier dealing with an Omega market girl, and said, "You can calculate prices?" "Better than you can, apparently," she had told him. The market went quiet. She realized what she had said, and to whom. Then Cadmus laughed, not the surprised bark of someone caught off guard, but the deep, genuine laugh of a man who has found something he did not know he was looking for. By the time she finished the story, the tea was cold, and Grillian was smiling. It was not the public smile, the one designed to communicate stability and authority to the pack. It was something smaller and more private, a smile that lived in the area around his eyes more than in his mouth, that came from a place several layers below the performance. She had seen glimpses of it before, in unguarded moments across the council table. She had been careful not to show that she had noticed. She was having increasing difficulty with that particular discipline. "He sounds like the best kind of man," Grillian said. His voice was gentler than she had ever heard it in the council room. "He was," she said. "Not perfect, but honest about what he was, which is rarer and more valuable than perfect." He looked at his cold cup, turning it slightly in his hands. Large hands, she noted, not for the first time, with a precision of gesture that seemed at odds with the scale of them, as if his hands had been trained to work at a finer resolution than their size suggested. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You don't usually ask first," she observed. "This is different." She waited. "Does it get easier?" he said. "Being responsible for everyone. Knowing that the decisions you make, even the good ones, even the right ones, cost someone something." He stopped. "Does that part become smaller over time? Or does it just become more practiced at being quiet?" The question landed in the room with a weight she had not expected. She thought about it honestly. "I think," she said carefully, "it becomes more bearable as you become better at carrying it. But I don't think it becomes smaller. I think if it became smaller, it would mean you'd started seeing people as less than people." A pause. Cadmus said the day a commander stops feeling the weight of his decisions is the day his soldiers should start worrying. Grillian was looking at her with the full force of his attention, which was, she had come to understand, a significant quantity of force. There was something concentrated and still in his focus, like deep water. "You do that," he said. "That thing Cadmus did." "Which thing?" "You say the truest thing. Right in the center. Not around it." He seemed to be trying to find words for something. "Most people talk in circles around the true thing because the true thing is hard to hold. You just..." Hold it. She felt the warmth in her chest move upward and become something else, something she had not been allowing herself to name. And she said, "Cadmus taught me that too." They were quiet for a moment, the good kind of quiet, the kind that is full rather than empty. "You should sleep," she said finally, because one of them had to say something practical. "So should you," he said. "I will." He stood, and the room seemed to rearrange itself slightly around the movement, as it always did when he stood. There was simply a great deal of him to stand up, and it affected the available space in a way that was not unpleasant. He paused at the door. "The pack called you mad," he said, not as cruelty and not as apology, as observation. "The pack calls many things mad that turn out to be necessary," she said. He turned and looked at her for one last moment, in the lamplight, and she held his gaze because she had learned, again from Cadmus, who had a considerable amount to say about the politics of eye contact, that looking away first is a concession, and she had not survived Omega life by making unnecessary concessions. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on this." She understood that he was not only talking about the food. The siege entered its second month. The pack was hungry, but not starving. This was the difference between catastrophe and survival, and everyone in the castle walls understood by now where that difference had come from. The laughter that had followed Nubia through the summer like a second shadow had been replaced by something else, by the particular silence of people who are reassessing a fundamental error of judgment. She moved through the castle halls and felt people watch her, not with mockery now, but with an attention that had not yet decided what it wanted to become. She was not interested in their reassessment. She was interested in the rye grain stores in the northwestern cellar, which had developed a moisture problem she needed to address before it became a mold problem, and in the new rationing schedule she was revising to account for the fact that winter was coming faster than the siege calendar had predicted. She was interested also, though she had given herself strict instructions about this, in whether Grillion would stop by her door that evening. He did. He had taken to stopping by most evenings, bringing whatever tea or warm broth the castle kitchens were producing that night, and they would sit at her small table and talk in the way she had only previously talked with Cadmus. Without performance, without the careful social calculation that most conversations required. The way you talk when you have determined, mutually and silently, that there is nothing to protect here except the truth. On the 14th evening, he told her about his father. The previous Alpha King, a man of tremendous capability and very limited warmth, who had prepared his son for leadership with a comprehensiveness that left no room for uncertainty and very little room for anything else. Who had died when Grillion was 23, leaving him a kingdom well organized and a pack well governed, and an inner life that was largely a series of locked rooms he had never been given permission to open. He didn't believe in vulnerability, Grillion said. He believed it was a vector for attack. In most contexts he was wrong, Nubia said quietly. Vulnerability is just being honest about what you are, and people who can't do that can't trust. He looked at her. Can't trust, he agreed. A pause. Before this, I trusted my general ethos, and myself mostly. He stopped, started again more carefully. I'm learning that my judgment about who is worth trusting was incomplete. She understood what he was not quite saying. You can trust me, she said. Not because I was right about the siege, but because I have no interest in deceiving you. I'm not interested in what you can give me. I'm interested in what you actually are. The silence that followed this was the densest quiet she had ever been in with another person. When he finally spoke, his voice had a texture she had not heard in it before. It was the voice of someone who has been waiting for a very specific thing for a very long time without being willing to name what they were waiting for. What am I? He said. She considered him across the small table, in the lamplit warmth, with the siege fires visible through the western window, and the cold smell of approaching winter coming through the gaps in the stone. "A man who wants to be seen," she said. "More than he wants to be right. More than he wants to be feared." She paused. "And who doesn't know what to do with someone who's actually looking?" He was very still. "You're looking," he said. "I have been for a while," she said simply. The night deepened around them, and they did not move from the small table. And they talked until the siege fires died to embers, and the cold pushed through the window, and she wrapped her hands around her cup for warmth, and at some point, without either of them deciding on it, the conversation moved from the honest to the intimate, not in gesture but in quality, in the way the air between them changed, in the way he leaned forward without seeming to intend it, in the way she stopped calculating the distance between them and simply registered it as fact. It was not a moment with edges. It was not a moment that announced itself. It was simply a before and then an after. And in the after, they both knew something had changed that could not be unchanged, and neither of them seemed to want it to be. The siege entered its 3rd month. Outside the walls, the Eastern Army had settled in for the long siege they had planned. There were difficulties inside. There are always difficulties in a siege, because human nature is not built for prolonged scarcity, and tends to express its distress toward whoever is maintaining order. Nubia received a considerable amount of displaced anger from people who were hungry and frightened and needed somewhere to put it. She received it with equanimity, addressed the legitimate grievances, and disregarded the illegitimate ones, and continued working. What she had not anticipated was how hard it would be to maintain her composure in the evenings, when the castle quieted, and she was alone in her room with the knowledge of what had grown between them, and no framework yet for what to do with it. She was frightened by it. Not because the feeling itself was frightening. It was warm and inevitable in the way of things that have been true for a while before being named. She was frightened by the position it put her in. She was an Omega widow. He was the Alpha King. She had lived at the Omega end of that structure long enough to know what it cost when you forgot that structures do not bend for feelings. She told herself this every night, sitting in her window watching the eastern fires. She was still telling herself this on the morning of the 42nd day of the siege, when Grillian came to the larder, not during the usual council hours, and stood in the doorway watching her work for a long moment before she acknowledged him. "Is something wrong?" she said, without turning around. "Several things," he said. "The Eastern cavalry made another push at the northern gate this morning. Ethos held them, but it cost us." A pause. "That's not what I came about." She turned then. He was in the doorway in the morning light, large and dark and tired in the bone-deep way of siege tiredness that comes from sustained alertness and accumulated loss. There were shadows under his eyes she had been tracking for weeks. There was something in his face today that had come to a decision. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, about being seen." She waited. "I've been seen by many people in many ways," he said. He moved into the room as he spoke, not hurried, the deliberate movement of a man choosing his words and his steps at the same pace. "My generals see a commander. The pack sees a king. My advisors see a resource." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the sheer physical presence of him, which she had spent considerable energy being professional about. "You see something else, something that doesn't have a title." "I see you," she said, because it was the simplest true thing. He reached out and did something she did not expect. He took her hand, both of her hands, enclosing them completely in his without any of the performance of the gesture. Just the fact of it. The warmth of his palms around the cold of her fingers. "I know what I want," he said. "I've known for a while. I wasn't sure I had the right to want it." She looked up at him. She had to look up. The height differential between them was significant, and there was something both strange and deeply familiar about that, as if this specific angle had always been the correct geometry for her perspective on the world. "You think I'm not sure what I want," she said. I think, he said carefully, that you're very careful about the difference between what you want and what is possible, and that you may have decided they're different things. She considered this. They might be, she said. They don't have to be. You're the Alpha King, she said, not as complaint, as mathematics. I know what I am, he said, and she recognized her own words from weeks ago returned to her, and felt something move in her chest like a room suddenly full of light. I also know what I want to be. To you. She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who was ferocious with the world and gentle with her, who commanded 10,000 pack wolves with an authority that was never in doubt, who sat at her small table in the evenings and let her see the unlocked rooms, who had come to stand in her field at the edge of summer and had looked at her work and understood what it meant, who had come for her in the chaos of the first siege day before he went anywhere else. What do you want to be? She said quietly. The person you talk to, he said. At the end of the day, when there's nothing to protect and nowhere to perform. His hands tightened slightly around hers. Whatever that is. She thought about Cadmus. She thought about what Cadmus would say, and she knew in the specific way you know things that come from 30 years of loving someone and listening to them carefully, that Cadmus would say, the heart is not a wound that heals by staying closed. He had told her this, in fact, in one of his last clear afternoons, though she had not understood at the time that he was telling her something intended for her future, rather than her present. She thought about the Omega in her, the part that had learned to need nothing from anyone, because needing things had always been the first step toward being disappointed. She thought about the summer and the salt and the rows of dried meat and the choice she had made, every day, to prepare for the world as it was, rather than the world as the comfortable wanted it to be. She thought about choices, about the ones you make from necessity and the ones you make from will. All right, she said, and then, because she was who she was, but I need you to understand that I am not a woman who adjusts herself to fit the shape of what someone else needs. I am what I am. That includes being right when I'm right and saying so. I know, he said, and the smile that was in his eyes before it was in his mouth appeared in its fullest form, which she had not seen before, and which was, she was willing to admit this, in the privacy of her own thoughts, extraordinarily good to look at. And I am not interested in being decorative, she said. You couldn't be if you tried, he said. She looked at him for a moment. That might be the most accurate compliment I've ever received, she said. He laughed. It was the same kind of laugh Cadmus had laughed at the market, the real laugh, the full-chest laugh of a man who has found something that surprises him into joy. It filled the small larder room and changed the quality of the light in it somehow, and Nubia stood in the sound of it and let it happen around her, and felt for the first time in a long time that being surprised could be something other than dangerous. She did not let go of his hands. The siege broke in the beginning of the 4th month. The Western Allies, the Thornwood Pack, and the river kingdoms of the Elvar coast, who had received word through the underground communication routes that Grillion had maintained at significant effort and cost, arrived on a morning that began with fog and ended with fire. The Allied forces hit the Eastern Army from the rear, before the siege camp had finished its breakfast, and the battle that followed was decisive and quick. The way battles are when one side has been slowly starving and the other has not. The Eastern Army withdrew. The trade roads opened. The first supply carts came through the gates of the kingdom before the fog had fully cleared, and the pack, who had survived on Nubia's provisions and on the peculiar dignity that comes from enduring something together, poured out into the main yard of the castle in a noise of relief that she heard from the larder, where she was doing one final inventory. She finished the inventory before she went outside. There was a formality to ending things properly. You account for what you began with and what you have now, and you write down the difference, and only then do you close the ledger. She walked out into the yard with her birch bark pages under her arm and found the pack transformed by relief. People who had been rationing their emotions for months, spilling them now all at once. She stood at the edge of it and watched. Marit, the council's head administrator, found her and said simply, "You saved us." "Cadmus saved you," Nubia said. "I just listened." "The same thing," Marit said, and moved away into the crowd. Nubia stood in the yard thinking about what came next. The farmlands, the trade routes, the recovery of a pack that had been under siege for more than 100 days. She was not thinking about herself. Which was why she did not notice Grillian until he was standing in front of her, the yard grown subtly quieter around them, the full attention of several hundred pack wolves settling into something deliberate. He was in his formal coat, she noticed. Someone had found the time and the presence of mind to dress him appropriately for a public occasion. Or perhaps he had done it himself. She could imagine him doing it himself, with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. "Nubia Wanderer," he said. His voice was the public voice, the carrying voice, the one designed to reach the back of the yard without appearing to raise itself. She felt the crowd register the shift, felt them orient. She raised her head. "You came to this pack as an Omega widow," he said. "You were given less than you were owed by nearly everyone, including me." The pause was precise, neither too long nor too short. "You chose anyway to prepare, to work, to see what others refused to see, and because of that choice, made alone, sustained alone, maintained against the ridicule of people who should have known better. This pack is alive." He stopped. The yard was very quiet. "I can never repay what you gave us," he said. "The kingdom is standing because you stood first." His voice changed then, dropped out of the formal register into something lower and more direct, still carrying but no longer performing. "But I want to tell you, in front of everyone who laughed at you and everyone who didn't, that you are the most remarkable person I have met in my life, and I would like you to stay." She looked at him. The morning light was on him, and the fog was burning off now, and the sound of the Allied forces' celebration outside the walls was coming over the parapet in waves, and she was standing in the yard with her birch bark pages under her arm and her white hair loose, because there had not been time for much in the way of personal arrangement this morning, and she was aware of hundreds of eyes, and she did not much care about the hundreds of eyes. She cared about the 2 gray ones directly in front of her. "Stay in what capacity?" she said, because she was who she was. He looked at her, and the smile that lived in his eyes before it reached his mouth arrived, and it was the full version, the one she had seen in the larder, the one that was worth waiting for. "As my equal," he said, "as my partner, as the person I talk to when there's nothing to protect. A beat. As my queen, if you'll have it. But the title matters less than the rest." The yard remained very quiet. Nubia looked at him for a moment. She thought about the Omega in her, not the diminished version, the one the pack had laughed at, but the actual version, the one Cadmus had known, the one that had risen before the birds all summer and done the difficult necessary work because it needed to be done. She thought about Cadmus's voice in the dark. Not yet. Not yet. And then, now. She thought about what she had told Grillian in the larder. "I am not a woman who adjusts herself to fit the shape of what someone else needs." And she thought about the fact that he had not asked her to. "Yes," she said. Not because she owed it. Not because she feared what came otherwise. Not because the title glittered or the position offered protection she could not provide herself. Because she chose it. Because he was worth choosing. Because Cadmus had taught her, among all the other things, that the heart, carefully maintained and intelligently provisioned, is capable of outlasting any siege. The sound that came from the pack was not formal. It was not the ritualized acknowledgement of royal announcement. It was the sound of several hundred people who have been through something terrible together and survived, making the noise of people who have been given, unexpectedly, something good. It took a long time to die down. In the weeks that followed the lifting of the siege, the kingdom engaged in the slow work of reconstruction. The eastern farmlands needed replanting. The trade routes needed renegotiating. The castle needed repairs. Nubia oversaw the provisioning logistics with the same attention she had given the siege stores. She was also learning what it meant to occupy a new position in the pack's hierarchy, not because she was uncertain of herself, but because genuine newness requires genuine attention. What she discovered was that the pack now looked at her with something trying to become pride, as if her rightness had become something they could claim retroactively as their own. She observed this with her characteristic dry accuracy and said nothing about it. People revised their stories when they needed to. The work of a community is partly to make those revisions possible without too much loss of face. She let them revise. She kept the cave system. She reshelved it with new stores from the good summer harvest. She began, in the long light evenings of the following summer, to dry meat again. Nobody laughed. Some people came to ask her to teach them. She did. She sat in the summer evenings and taught the calculations to whoever came, because being nearly starved has a way of making provisioning suddenly fascinating. Grillion watched from the field road one evening without announcing himself. She had learned his habit of watching before speaking and stopped being startled by it. He was leaning against the fence post in his plain coat, the low sun turning his dark hair copper at the edges. She finished the lesson. The pack members dispersed. She walked toward him. "They don't laugh anymore," he said. "No," she agreed. "Are you satisfied by that?" "Not satisfied," she said. "They shouldn't have needed a siege to understand it, but I'm not interested in holding it against them. It doesn't serve anything." He looked at her with that full gray gaze. "You're extraordinary," he said. Not as flattery, as conclusion. "I'm practical," she said. "The same thing," he said. She reached up and adjusted the collar of his coat, which had turned under. This was the sort of thing she did now. Small domestic gestures, care expressed in the smallest useful actions. He caught her hand and held it. "Come inside," he said. "I have something I want to show you." She went. The following spring, Nubia discovered she was pregnant. She received the information with the same equanimity she received most things, sitting with it for a full day before she did anything about it, letting it settle into the landscape of what she knew and felt and planned. What she found, when she looked honestly, was not fear. It was something warmer and more animal than thought, the body's own knowledge asserting itself, and she respected that kind of intelligence. She told Grillion that evening. He was very still for a moment. Then he put his hands on her face, very gently, with the particular gentleness he reserved entirely and exclusively for her. This man who was formidable with his generals and ferocious with enemies, and who had a stillness in him that she had watched the pack interpret as remoteness, but that she understood was not remoteness at all, was instead the discipline of a man with enormous reserves of feeling that he had spent most of his life not knowing what to do with. He held her face in his hands and looked at her with the fullness of what he was when there was nothing to protect and nowhere to perform. "Are you all right?" he said. "More than all right," she said, which was true. He pressed his forehead to hers and held it there, and she felt his breath even out from whatever pattern it had been holding and settle into something deeper and quieter. And they stood in the room like that for a while, forehead to forehead, in the good silence. "A child," he said softly, as if testing the weight of the word. "Apparently," she said. He laughed against her forehead, and the laugh moved through her like warmth. "What do you want?" he said. "For yourself, not for the kingdom or the succession or any of the rest of it. What do you want?" She thought about it. "To do it the same way we've done everything else," she said, "without pretending things are simple when they aren't. Honestly." a beat. Together, he lifted his head and looked at her, and what was in his face was the full picture, every version of him. The king and the warrior, and the tired man at the small table, and the man learning to trust, and the man who had stood at the edge of her field in the summer heat, and had the honesty to say, "I am not sure." All of them visible at once, without the careful management she usually saw him employ. "Together," he said. The pregnancy was easy. She modified her work accordingly, not with sacrifice but with adjustment, the way you adapt any system to changed conditions without abandoning the underlying logic. She still managed the kingdom's food logistics, taught the provisioning classes, kept the cave stores stocked. She added to her inventory a new column: resources required for a child. Grillian watched all of this with an attention she had long since learned to distinguish from surveillance. It was the attention of someone genuinely interested in how another person moves through the world. She had lived in the warmth of it long enough now that she was accustomed to it. And the fact of that accustomedness, the fact that this large and formidable man's constant regard had become something she simply lived inside, was itself something she thought about with private wonder. He had not known how to be soft when she met him. He had learned, not because she asked him to, but because she had given him the one thing that allows people to change, the experience of being fully seen and not found wanting. Cadmus had done this for her, at a market salt stall. She had done it for Grillian across a kitchen table in the middle of a siege, by accident and by nature. She thought sometimes about the thread connecting these things: the old warrior's death, the widow's work, the summer's laughter, the siege, the cave. The way one thing led to another with the logic of necessity, and the grace of what she could only call, for lack of a better word, fate. Not the passive kind, the fate of paths that open when you are honest enough and present enough to see them. The daughter arrived in the early weeks of winter, impatient and emphatic about her arrival, and was laid in Nubia's arms in the gray morning light, with the look that very new people have of being ancient and brand new simultaneously, as if they carry all of human time in their faces and all of the specific future in their bones. She had Grillian's dark coloring in the brow and the jaw, and Nubia's coloring in the hair, pale, startlingly pale, almost blonde, and eyes that were a particular shade of golden gray that didn't belong to either of them, and made the midwife, old practical Sina, shake her head with something between amazement and approval, and say, "Oh, she'll be trouble," which Nubia took as the highest possible compliment. She named her Carillia. Grillian held her that first morning with the concentrated attentiveness of a man doing something he has never done before, and is determined to do correctly, which was so precisely him that Nubia felt a wave of something that had no precise name, watching him. He was not performing fatherhood. He was not producing the theater of warmth for an audience. He simply held his daughter in his arms and looked at her with his full gray gaze, the one that saw the whole picture, and whatever picture he saw there, reorganized something in him that she could see in the lines of his face and the set of his shoulders. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, in the voice he used when there was nothing to protect. Carillia, demonstrating the family characteristic of directness, attempted to eat his thumb. He looked up at Nubia with the full smile. She smiled back. The years moved in the way of years when they are full and well organized, not slowly, not quickly, but with the satisfying density of time occupied correctly, every season bringing its distinct work, and its distinct pleasures, and its ongoing accumulation of meaning. Carillia grew. She was loud in the particular way of children raised in households where honesty is practiced openly, where she saw her mother correct her father in council meetings, and her father receive the correction without shrinking, and sometimes return it. She was curious in the way of children given good questions before easy answers. She had her grandfather Cadmus's eyes in a shade entirely her own, her mother's white hair worn the same way, and her father's sighs arriving steadily and without apology. She wanted most specifically to know the story. Nubia told her, without embellishment, without self-pity, with the same precision she applied to calculations, which was not coldness but clarity, and which Carillia seemed to understand was a form of love. "Why did they laugh?" Carillia asked once, at 7, sitting on the summer field fence while they hung meat together. "Because they hadn't needed what I was preparing for yet," Nubia said. "Things that haven't happened are easy to mock, but you knew it would happen. I believed it would. Your grandfather Cadmus knew what to watch for. I watched for it." Carillia was quiet, looking at the hanging rows. "Do you still watch for things?" she asked. "Always," Nubia said. "And the drying meat? Is that because of the signs?" "Partly," Nubia said. "And partly because there's a kind of knowledge you practice even when you don't need it, so that when you do need it, you haven't forgotten the shape of it." She looked at the rows of meat, at the summer light through them, at the familiar architecture of her own careful preparation that had become, over the years, not only emergency planning but a form of memory, a physical argument for the value of attention and foresight, and the particular courage that is required to prepare for a disaster that has not yet happened while everyone around you insists it never will. Cadmus was in this field. She felt him here sometimes, in the smell of the salt and the weight of the late summer sun, in the patient logic of the work itself, not as ghost, not as grief, as knowledge that had made its way through love into action and had settled, finally, into the landscape of ordinary days. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Grillian coming across the field in his plain coat, the one that meant he had come from work and not from ceremony, his black hair pulled back with the leather cord, shorter than it had been in the early years, but still dark, still his, still arriving in a room before the rest of him in the way of things that have presence. He stopped beside her and looked at the rows of meat, and then at Carillia on the fence, and something in his face did the thing it did when he looked at both of them in the same moment, which was to become transparent in the way of water that is very deep and very clear. "Still at it," he said to Carillia. "Mama says you have to practice knowledge even when you don't need it," Carillia said, with the authority of someone passing along recently received wisdom. "Your mother is right," he said. He said this the way he always said it, as a statement of fact rather than a concession, which was something Nubia had noticed the first time and had continued to notice every time since, because it was rare, and she was always interested in rare things. He stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder. She asked about the roots. He answered. They stood in the salted summer air in the peace of two people who know each other completely and require nothing beyond presence. The stores accumulated, season by season. Carillia learned the inventory system at 8, the calculation formulas at 9, and by 10 could run a full provisions assessment faster than most castle administrators. She told the story of the siege to anyone who would listen, adding details as the layers became visible to her, including the cave, which her father showed her on a winter morning when she was 12, running his hands along the shelving and saying without sentiment, "Your mother saw what others refused to see, and she prepared for it, and when the time came, it was there." Carillia looked at him in the cave's dim light, and understood from the way he said it that this was not merely a historical lesson. It was a love letter. The years moved. The pack grew. New alliances formed with 3 eastern territories, including one Varek clan from the besieging army, negotiated over 4 years with Grillian's military authority and Nubia's economic precision. The Varek representative, a weathered woman named Kara, told Nubia she had never encountered a negotiator who did their arithmetic so quickly and their sentiments so slowly. Nubia thanked her and filed the observation away. She was 53 when the second siege came. From the west this time, a coalition she had been tracking for 4 years. She briefed the council 18 months before the siege lines appeared, with the same birch bark pages, the same format, the same careful handwriting. The council, which included members who had been taught the provisioning system by Nubia as teenagers, took the briefing seriously. They had learned that lesson. The stores were full, the cave system expanded, the rationing protocols established and practiced. When the second siege broke after 6 weeks, the Allied force arriving before the pack had gone hungry even once, Kyrillia stood in the castle yard beside her parents, 31 years old and watching the gates open, wearing the expression she had inherited from both of them. Her father's stillness, her mother's clarity, and something particular to herself made from both. "We prepared for this," Nubia told the young council member who credited her alone. "I started it, but it hasn't been mine alone for a long time." She felt Grillian at her shoulder, the way she had felt him at her shoulder for 30 years, a presence she had long since incorporated into the structure of her days, the way you incorporate the quality of light from a window you love, until you cannot imagine the room without it. He took her hand. "All right?" he said. "Yes," she said. She was. That summer, Kyrillia came to the field in the early morning and stood at its edge looking at the rows of drying meat with an expression her mother recognized, the expression of someone who has known a thing their whole life and is seeing it for the first time. She was carrying her own knife differently than she had ever carried it before. "Teach me the drying ratios again," she said. "Not the way you taught me at 10, the way you know them." Nubia looked at her daughter, this direct and formidable and deeply feeling woman with her white blonde hair in the morning sun, and her father's hands and her grandfather's eyes, and felt something complete in her chest, something that was the shape of a circle closed. "Come here then," she said. She showed her. Not quickly, not with impatience. With the full transmission of everything she knew, and everything Cadmus had known, passed from hand to hand in the salt smell of a summer morning, while the world kept its distance, and the work was everything. They worked together until midday. Grillian brought them water from the well and sat on the fence without saying anything, and they did not explain themselves to him, and he did not require explanation, and the three of them existed in the field in the way of people who know each other completely and require nothing from each other beyond presence. At midday, Kyrillia looked at the finished rows and said, "How do you know when you've stored enough?" "When you've calculated what you might need," Nubia said, "and then calculated for what you couldn't have anticipated, and stored for that too. That's a lot. That's why it takes all summer. Not out of fear, not out of compulsion, out of knowledge, out of love. Out of the particular respect she owed to a man who had told her true things in the dark at the end of his life, and to the kingdom that had survived because she had listened, and to herself, who had done the work when it was lonely and kept doing it when it was laughed at, and had been right, and had learned that being right is not its own reward, but that the people still alive because you were right are." She picked up her knife. The meat waited on the rack, patient and necessary, in the long warm light. She began, "We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time."